Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff is in Moscow today for a meeting with Vladimir Putin on ending the war in Ukraine. Witkoff will be joined by the US president's son-in-law Jared Kushner, but not Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's seen as more sympathetic to Ukraine. Matthew Chance is CNN's chief global affairs correspondent and joins us now from Moscow. Good morning.
Morning, Kate. How's it going?
Good, thank you. So what's the expectation today? I mean, we can come to talk about some of the controversies when it comes to Steve Witkoff and whether he's the right man to lead these talks. But what's the expectation?
I think expectations are pretty low, given that there have been numerous attempts to try and get Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin to compromise on its core demands to end the war in Ukraine. But nevertheless, you can't sort of deny the sort of pace of US diplomacy and the energy they've put into it. There have been successive meetings in Geneva last week, in South Florida a couple of days ago, where they've been meeting with the Ukrainians to try and sort of hammer out a common position on what they can present to the Russians. From what I've learned from my sources with direct knowledge of those negotiations, there have been sort of a few kind of solutions discussed or tabled during those meetings. Nothing's been finalized. But I think the role of Witkoff and Jared Kushner today in Moscow, and they're going to be having their meetings with President Putin later on in the second half of this day, their role is to present the Kremlin sort of with those potential solutions to the big problems and to sort of get a sense of whether he is prepared to stop the fighting, whether he's prepared to cut short the war, or his war, and kind of do a deal, or whether he wants to press ahead with his hardline demands as he has done in the past. And so it's a pretty crucial moment.
And so what you talk about solutions to some of these intractable problems, what kind of thing are we talking about? Because at the moment, some of the areas are the issue around territory, around control. I mean, I think that there are some suggestions around demilitarized zones, for example. What are we talking about when it comes to those complex areas that have yet to be resolved?
Yeah, that issue of territory is a central one. This is a demand by Russia for Ukraine to withdraw from areas of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, that Russia has annexed in its constitution, made it part of Russia, but has not yet been able to conquer. The Kremlin wants all that territory handed over, and that area includes the fortress belt of heavily fortified towns and cities in eastern Ukraine that tens of thousands of Ukrainians have been sacrificed to defend. And so it's obviously a very big political issue in Ukraine for them to do that, and they've categorically said they won't do it. There are a number of solutions that have been presented. Most recently, a US proposal to make it a demilitarized zone, but under the control of Russia, which the Kremlin would then commit to not putting military forces into. There's been suggestions of territory swaps and things like that. There is something, I'm told, that the Ukrainians would find acceptable, but they're not telling me at the moment what the specifics of that deal are. They said it would threaten it if they were to make it public. But nevertheless, there are discussions underway that would allow Ukraine to get around the various red lines it's laid down. I mean, another issue is NATO, of course, NATO membership. I mean, this has been something that's been enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, their aspiration to join NATO. I'm told by sources inside those negotiations that the Ukrainians are willing to accept the idea of being barred from NATO, but stop short of legally changing their constitution about their aspiration to join NATO. So, if the US wants to do a deal with Russia to say we'll always block Ukraine from joining NATO, I think there's a sense in Ukraine they might be prepared to accept that, as long as Putin accepts it. And so that's the big challenge. It's not just like getting a deal with the Ukrainians, it's getting the Russians to accept it, and that's the big challenge.
I'll come back to the point about Putin in just a second, but on that point about security for Ukraine, if they are willing to accept that as a compromise position on NATO, what kind of security guarantees might we be talking about for Ukraine to be able to accept something like a demilitarized zone?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, they haven't accepted that yet. That's a decision that's being set back for the president of Ukraine to make once they know the position of the Russians. But look, yes, it all does depend on security guarantees, because Ukraine wants to make sure that if it accepts various compromises, it's not going to leave itself exposed to a third invasion later on by Russian forces, that it's not going to leave itself kind of a satellite state of Moscow. And so obviously the kinds of security arrangements that Ukrainians are calling for, I mean, just the other day, writing in, I think it was the Sunday Telegraph, General Zaluzhny, who's now the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom, said that he wants nuclear weapons stationed on Ukrainian territory, saying that he wants, a large contingent of foreign troops there, sort of Article 5 style NATO security guarantees. These are the kind of things that Ukraine is calling for. But these are also the sorts of security guarantees that the United States, amongst others, have ruled out for Ukraine. And so the negotiation is what could be done instead of that.
And in terms of what's happening on the ground at the moment, overnight we hear Russia claiming to have captured Pokrovsk. Do we know if that is confirmed? I think the Ukrainian side hadn't confirmed it yet, but has there been any movement on that?
No, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that the Russians have been making slow but steady advances in eastern Ukraine, and the fact that this, taking of Pokrovsk, if it's true, has been made just before Witkoff and Jared Kushner enter the Kremlin, I think sort of underlines that Kremlin narrative that they're winning the war and they've got no reason to come to a negotiated settlement because they're going to get everything they want through military means anyway. That's Putin's sort of publicly stated position. And the idea that they've now taken this important town of Pokrovsk will just serve for the Kremlin to underline that.
Can we just talk finally about the personalities? I mean, Steve Witkoff, there's a lot of controversy around Steve Witkoff. I mean, there was a leaked conversation in which he appeared to be coaching the Russians on how to get the most out of President Trump by flattering him, essentially. And obviously we know that Putin is a difficult player at the best of times. Do we know, is Steve Witkoff the right man for these conversations? And do people have trust in this development?
I think there's a lot of skepticism around it, isn't there? But certainly Witkoff seems to be trusted by President Trump. You're right; he's been accused by his critics of being much too close to the Kremlin. That conversation where he apparently advised or coached the Kremlin on how to get the best out of Trump was the latest example of that. But when he first met Vladimir Putin as well, he was very criticized for the fact that he put his hand on his heart, as he kind of greeted the Russian leader, and he's often spoken about how he's got a relationship and a friendship with Vladimir Putin. It's all fueled this idea that he's much too close to the negotiation. I think Trump sees that as a positive, though. If you can befriend the person on the other side of the table, I think the rationale is that you can get more out of them. And so I think that's probably why he's been deployed on this task.
And finally, Putin, do we know where he stands in all of this? Is this a bit of a charade for him, or is he really in the market for a deal?
Well, that's a good question, actually, and I think it's a bit of both. Look, I mean, I think Putin would, if a deal, he wants the deal that meets all of his terms. So if he can negotiate a deal that gives him everything he wants, then absolutely fine. The big question is he prepared to compromise in any way? And so far, from what we've seen, he's been totally tied to and unwilling to move from his core sort of maximalist demands, to basically subjugate Ukraine. I've not seen anything to suggest otherwise, but I mean, that's why these meetings are so interesting, to see whether there is any movement on the Kremlin side, whether they are going to sort of step towards a negotiated settlement, or whether they're just going to press ahead with the conflict.
Matthew, thank you so much. Really great to have your take. We appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
That is Matthew Chance, the CNN's chief global affairs correspondent, joining us from Moscow.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take the biggest skeptic in the world to think Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, Vladimir Putin in a room together. Is a just peace going to emerge for Ukraine out of that room? It seems to be at least a prudent level of scepticism to exercise at this stage, but we will see over the course of the day. They're meeting this afternoon. We'll see what emerges from that and then how the spinning begins.